What up, goed je kijkt. Daar van ITAesthetic. Jongens, ik heb zojuist een volgens mij uurdurende interview gehouden met Milo Wolf. Fantastisch interview. Jongens, ik raad je echt aan deze video te checken om alles op te nemen wat hier besproken wordt. Dit is de laatste wetenschap. Zorg dat je deze video checkt. Zorg dat je het allemaal tot je neemt. Omdat dit loopt zoveel verder dan heel veel mensen van jullie trainen. En hoeveel mensen in de gym op dit moment hun workouts doen. Dus leer van deze workout. Ik heb hier dit jaar heel veel aan gewerkt. Maar alles wat wij bespreken in deze video. Het heeft mij super erg geholpen om meer gains te maken. En we willen allemaal meer gains. We willen gespierder worden. Dat is het enige wat telt in het leven. Dus kijk de video van mij en Milo Wolf. Let's go.
Yo.
Yo, Milo. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly. The only thing is I do not see myself. Is my camera off? Okay.
Let's do it. That's awesome.
Awesome, man.
Meanwhile, I'm recording my screen. I'm also recording with my camera. I've got my microphone linked. So audio should be fine. I can hear you perfectly. You've got a very good mic. Hopefully you can hear me fine as well. Well, let's start then, I guess.
Let's do it.
All right, Milo. Obviously, I know very good who you are. I've followed you. The first time I think I came across your videos was like 8 months ago. And I really started implementing some of your stuff like heavily 6 months ago. So yeah, I was very amazed by the progress I've been making so far. Like I've told you in the Instagram DMs, I'm like a lifetime natural myself. And in 2023, this year, I'm objectively seeing more gains than I've like made in the past years. For the people that don't know who you are, like me, and I have a Dutch audience, and they're way behind, let's say, on the science and everything. So please introduce yourself, tell them who you are, what you're all about, and let's get into it.
First of all, I just want to point out that even though you claim natty, I can see your arms. You're not natty.
I'm on everything,
Big
brother.
natty over there, you know? Yeah, so thank you for the warm introduction. My name is Milo Wolf, soon to be doctor, actually. And in fact, I'll be defending my PhD in 6 days. So hopefully soon I'll be a doctor. But yeah, so my PhD specifically was on the effects of range of motion during lifting on hypertrophy and strength, right? And as you mentioned, one of the things that came about during my PhD was it seems as though doing some work in the lengthened range, specifically lengthened partials, is beneficial, right? So when you compare a full range of motion to, for example, shortened partials or training a muscle group at short muscle lengths, full range of motion is better. Likewise, though, when you compare lengthened partials or doing partial reps in a stretch position, that also seems to be better than full range of motion in 4 to 5 of the studies we have. And so overall, the picture emerges that training in lengthened position is a good thing for hypertrophy. And so to me personally, that's pretty important and pretty interesting. My background is in bodybuilding and powerlifting. So I've competed in both natural bodybuilding and in powerlifting. I've been lifting for about 10 years as well. That's kind of what led me to do a PhD in this topic in the first place. But yeah, it's good to hear that my lengthened partial stuff has helped you get even bigger arms because, you know,
It's the only thing that's important in life. I've got
a lot of questions. I feel like Andrew Huberman with all the notes and all the questions. I hope we can get
Shit,
them
you
all.
look like him too. You look like him too, you know?
He's a bit more pretty, I think.
But I do think I got bigger biceps. I've measured them last week, and I got. I'm in the 18-inch crew right now, so I'm a little higher body fat, like 20, above 20%. So you know, if I'm 10%, I won't have 18-inch arms, that's for sure. But I'm glad I'm very happy with this right now. Milo, for the people that don't know what you mean, what is the difference between a shortened and a lengthened partial? Because a lot of people don't know this. Can you, in a simple, can you explain it for the people?
So a shortened partial is just doing a partial rep, right? Like for example, a half squat in the shortened range for a given muscle group, right? So for example, a shortened partial could be a half squat where instead of going all the way down and getting a deep stretch in your quads, glutes, and outers, you kind of just go halfway down, for example, and that would be a shortened partial because you're doing a partial repetition in the shortened range for the main muscle groups involved. Equally, a lengthened partial would be the opposite. So essentially, you're doing a partial repetition, so not the full range of motion you could be doing. So for example, full range of motion for the squat would be from a full lockout to all the way down, for example, touching your hamstrings through your calves. That would be a full range of motion. A lengthened partial, on the other hand, would be the opposite of a half squat. So starting from about parallel and going all the way down to until when your hamstrings touch your calves. So most of the time when you see people training in the gym and doing partials, you will see shortened partials. And that's mostly by virtue of it being easier, right? Like when you think about a bench press, when you think about a squat, doing an RDL even, the shortened range, you can simply lift more weight typically. There is a few movements where that's not the case, but also these happen to be the movements where people don't do partials quite as much, right? So most people do partials in the gym. You see them on like benching, squatting, etc., but not so much in say pull downs or what have you. They don't often do shortened partials on pull downs. So that's essentially the difference between lengthened partials and shortened partials. It simply comes down to the muscle length at which you're training.
Yes. Great example. Thank you for the clarification for that. So I've got a lot of questions about lengthened partials. If you could answer it right now, right? Because there's a lot of discussion. Because we know kind of for certain that lengthened partials are better than shortened for hypertrophy, purely hypertrophy. We can say that pretty much with confirmation, like 100% confirm, right? Yes, all right. But first is full range of motion. Are you like certain that lengthened partials are better? Or you think that you need like a few more years to actually study it? So another question I could ask is like, do you only train lengthened partials yourself right now? Just only lengthened?
Sure. So I'll answer the question about the research first. We have 4 published studies comparing lengthened partials to a full range of motion and measuring muscle growth. We also have 1 study that's been presented at a conference, so it's not been published in a journal yet, but it's presented, so I'll include those findings as well, but you can take them or leave them. So if we count 4 plus 1, that's 5 studies. Out of those 5 studies, 4 show better hypertrophy when doing lengthened partials versus full range of motion. The final study shows no difference. In other words, out of all the studies we have comparing lengthened partials to a full range of motion, there is not a single study where full range of motion outperforms lengthened partials. Now, does that mean we know for sure that lengthened partials are better than full range of motion for hypertrophy? No, it's more of a confidence thing. At this point, you can be pretty confident, or even very confident, that you're not seeing less growth by doing lengthened partials versus full range of motion. And you can be reasonably confident, I think it's likely, that lengthened partials grow more muscle than full range of motion, at least within the context of these studies. Now, because we don't fully understand the mechanisms involved yet, it could very well be that in a few years' time we realize, oh, maybe it actually only applies to certain muscle groups, or maybe it only applies in relatively smaller time frames. However, that is becoming incrementally less likely because we have more and more studies coming out sort of showing the same thing, which is lengthened partials or lengthened work in general seems to be beneficial for a lot of different muscle groups, for example. And equally, the mechanisms behind it do not seem to suggest, for the time being, as we understand them now, that it's a short-lived phenomenon, and that, after 8 weeks of lengthened work, that's all you get. And so I think it's likely that you'll see more growth doing lengthened partials than full range of motion. But again, we only have 5 studies. And I think it's very, very, very likely that you're not missing out on any growth if you choose to lengthen partials over full range of motion. Now, as far as my own training goes, I've been doing... So it's been a very gradual process, right? When I first started my PhD and first kind of started to get an idea that, hey, lengthened work is kind of important. Like, for example, when I first saw the results of my own meta-analysis, and I was like, so first of all, range of motion doesn't play that big of a role for hypertrophy, period. Not as big as I thought, at least.
What was your hypothesis when you started your PhD? Were you already thinking like, oh, lengtheneds are better, or were you like, no clue?
So my strong bias or hunch going into my PhD was that full range of motion was best for hypertrophy. And that was predicated on the systematic review from Schoenfeld and Burjic back in 2020. That came out like a couple months before I started my PhD. And equally at the time, I was working for Renaissance periodization. Yeah. I was very much pro full range of motion, both in terms of the literature available and in terms of what I was actually practicing. So I was fully locking out my leg presses. I was, all that good stuff.
Dr. Mike style.
And then, exactly. And then as soon as I saw the results of a meta-analysis, I was like, So first of all, range of motion doesn't play as big of a role as we thought. Because there was a previous meta-analysis by Pilaris and colleagues in 2021 that showed an effect size of like 0.88 on hypertrophy, which is absurdly large. But when you look at more data, it turns out it's a pretty small impact, a trivial effect size. And then the second thing was, lengthened partials might have something to them as far as hypertrophy goes. And so I gradually started experimenting with it. Because my bias going into the meta-analysis and the PhD was pro for range of motion, it was a very gradual process where I started just doing some partials after my full range of motion, right? So I'd do like pull downs, I would do full range of motion, 10 reps, and as soon as I go close to failure, I would just do some partials and end the set. So kind of doing a lengthened superset, where you do full range of motion reps, and at the end of the set, you do lengthened partials. And I did that for a lot of exercises, especially back, biceps, side delts, that sort of stuff for a while. And then gradually it kind of started to dawn on me that we don't actually have any studies looking at this concept specifically, right? So we have lots of studies looking at the overall principle of lengthened training seems to be better for muscle growth than shortened training. That applies to lengthened partials versus shortened partials. It applies to isometric contractions at longer muscle lengths versus shorter muscle lengths. It also applies to full range of motion versus lengthened partials. But as far as actually implementing the lengthened superset, so doing a set with full range of motion reps first, followed by lengthened partials, we don't actually have any evidence looking at that specifically. So while it stands to reason that it would be beneficial, following the same overall principle of lengthened training being good for muscle growth, we just didn't have any evidence. And so given that we only have a few studies looking at lengthened partials to begin with, and these studies examine lengthened partials in their purest form, just actually doing lengthened partials as a standalone modality, I thought it made sense to actually just use lengthened partials and see what happened.
Yes.
And so for about the past, I kind of graduated, I guess, from doing lengthened supersets to incorporating more and more lengthened partials until about December 2022. So I guess about 10 months ago now, I've been doing basically exclusively lengthened partials. The reason I say basically exclusively is because I have had some strength goals as well at the same time, and those were more so for full range of motion squat, full range of motion deadlift, full range of motion bench, etc. And so some of my strength training, like in the sets of like 1 to 8, has been full range of motion on those movements. But otherwise, like I would say 80 to 90% of my training has been exclusively lengthened partials. And there's been time frames where it was just lengthened partials. So I guess that's my current training approach. And I'm a coach as well. And when I coach clients, if they're open to it and open to experimenting and, they don't have too strong of a bias going into it, typically I do heavily bias their training towards lengthened partials. And sometimes that can be taken all the way to what I'm doing, which is exclusively lengthened partials.
Awesome. All right. I have 3 things that I want to touch on the things that you said. The first one would be, so you stated that you're not sure what the mechanics perfectly sure what the mechanics would be behind why is a lengthened partial better for hypertrophy, because we're just talking about bigger muscles here, than perhaps shorten it. But if you would have to guess, what would be your reasoning why a lengthened partial would be better than a shortened for hypertrophy?
Sure. I think there are about 3 distinct mechanisms I can think of that are most likely, right? I'll start with the easiest one. When we look at the hypertrophy patterns after lengthened training versus shortened training, one thing we consistently see is that lengthened training results in about the same proximal growth as shortened training, but greater distal growth than shortened training. Let me quickly explain what that means. Proximal hypertrophy is referring to hypertrophy in the more proximal sites of a muscle group. So essentially closer to the origin point of a muscle group. Distal growth is more so related to the more distal areas or regions of muscle group, and that would be closer to the insertion point of a muscle group. And so essentially what you see is when you train with lengthened partials or any sort of lengthened bias, you see the same proximal growth, but greater distal growth compared to shortened training. It could be the case that you see greater overall hypertrophy, mostly or purely as an outcome of seeing greater distal hypertrophy. And perhaps that could suggest that when you do lengthened training, you activate those areas, those distal areas a little bit more, and thus get more hypertrophy in those areas. And there is some evidence linking activation measured by MRI, for example, to hypertrophy. And so it's possible that lengthened training simply recruits certain areas of the muscle a little bit more than shortened training, and thus results in more overall growth via that regional hypertrophy. That's one option. A second option would be related to tension. And there's 2 ways you can take this. So that's kind of the second and the third mechanism. One way is simply talking about overall tension. So when you're lengthening a muscle, you can kind of conceptualize it as being a rubber band, right? When you stretch out a rubber band, it kind of builds up tension because it wants to return to its resting length. A muscle and its connective tissues are the same way. So as you lengthen a muscle past its sort of resting length, and you stretch it out, as you would do, for example, during a lengthened partial, that muscle gradually builds up passive tension. And total tension is active tension plus passive tension. I just described passive tension. Active tension is the tension the muscle produces, for example, when you're lifting weights, in order to overcome that resistance, right? So you can actually lift the weight. And so if you're creating the same amount of active tension by lifting, right, where you're doing shortened partials, lengthened partials for range of motion, but you have a greater amount of passive tension involved when you're training at longer muscle lengths, that's a greater amount of total overall tension. And tension is the most robust or most established mechanism for inducing muscle hypertrophy. And so if by training at longer muscle lengths, we can get more passive tension and thus more overall tension, that could very feasibly lead to more hypertrophy. So that's mechanism number 2. Equally, for mechanism number 3, you could go the other way and say, hey, look, maybe it's not total tension, maybe it's that passive tension and active tension stimulate hypertrophy slightly differently. And so as opposed to just getting more active tension in there, getting a bit of both is synergistic, right? So when you get both a lot of active tension and a lot of passive tension, you get more overall hypertrophy than if you got all of your hypertrophy from just active tension, owing to different pathways involved in stimulating hypertrophy. So those are kind of the 3 mechanisms I would posit as to why lengthened training might be better than shortened training for hypertrophy.
Awesome, man. Whenever, because I'm now, maybe I don't fully train lengthened, but one thing I've really used, also with what you just described, is I try to get as much of a stretch on every muscle that I get. A lot of criticism I get in the comments from people that comment on my Instagram and YouTube are people that say that certain muscles, and I would love to hear your take on this, don't respond to the stretch mediated hypertrophy, right? Like the biceps. And there's, maybe you know these influencers, there's a lot of influence on TikTok, YouTube that say like, no, it doesn't work for the bicep, like Ryan Humiston, Paul Carter, and a lot of others. But my response is, I'm not sure, but whenever I see the data, also for the biceps, when we compare like studies, they still seem to grow more under like the lengthened versus shortened training when we compare studies. What would you say to like people that say, okay, certain muscles might not develop so well, or stretch mediated hypertrophy is not so good for those type of muscles, like the biceps?
Sure. So here's what I'd say. I think the main muscle groups that are often cited are the biceps and triceps. If you look at the overall literature we have comparing shortened training to lengthened training for the biceps and triceps, it's very much in line with other muscle groups, right? So you do have some null results. Like, for example, there's a study by Stasinaki and colleagues. There we go. Stasinaki and colleagues from 2018, I believe, where they compared pushdowns, so training at shorter muscle lengths for the long head, versus overhead extensions, training at long muscle lengths for the long head, showing no differences in hypertrophy. However, you also have more studies showing a benefit to longer muscle length training. So you have, for example, the Milo study, again, a similar design of pushdown versus overhead extension, this time showing a hypertrophy benefit for a long head in the triceps. And you also have, for example, a study of Godo and colleagues where they compared skull crushers either in sort of a lengthened partial fashion versus a full range of motion, and again, showing greater hypertrophy with lengthened partials. And so when you have this general principle, when you measure hypertrophy directly, that the calves seem to respond favorably to long muscle length training, the quads seem to respond favorably, the hamstrings seem to respond favorably, the biceps, the triceps, the glutes even now, with this most recent study that hasn't been published yet. If you have data in a variety of muscle groups that lengthened training seems to be better, I think at some point you can start establishing the principle of, hey, most or all muscle groups seem to respond favorably. And if you also have empirical evidence, and you could say, well, we need direct evidence in those muscle groups to confirm it. And I think part of me agrees with you, because I think until we have substantial evidence, we can't be sure. It's a matter of likelihood and confidence, right? But equally, we have evidence in the biceps and triceps. And so it is really difficult to explain away those findings that are essentially, those studies are designed to look at long muscle length training versus short muscle length training. It's really difficult to explain away those findings and say, oh, actually the biceps and triceps don't benefit in the face of results showing that they do benefit. And so I think what a lot of these influencers have done is essentially say, well, I don't think it was related to muscle length being trained. I think it was more so related to, say, the length-tension relationship, where the let's say, for example, the biceps, in the case of preacher curl studies, right? The biceps have better leverage at the bottom. And so it's not really because the biceps are being trained at lower muscle lengths. It's simply because they have better leverage. And so they're more emphasized compared to the short position, because in the short position, the brachioradialis and brachialis have better leverage. And that's interesting, but equally, what's worth keeping in mind, whenever you're talking about any sort of mechanistic rationale that is supposed to overrule empirical evidence, is that you need to have a pretty solid rationale. Because ultimately, when measuring the direct outcome of interest, in this case muscle growth, that very much takes precedence over any sort of mechanistic rationale you can come up with. Because when you're looking at these studies, for example, I could come up with 10 to 15 rationales that all point in diametrically opposing directions. Based on this mechanistic rationale, I could argue that we should see better hypertrophy. On this one, worse hypertrophy. So really, mechanistic rationales can lead you to very, very different places. And I think they should always come second to directly measuring the outcome of interest. And specifically, in this case, we're talking about neuromechanical matching, the principle of neuromechanical matching. The evidence for this and how it impacts hypertrophy is essentially non-existent. We have this principle is based on evidence in respiratory muscles, for example. There are, to my knowledge, no studies demonstrating that it's a mechanistic rationale worthy of consideration with regards to hypertrophy. In fact, for example, we have one study looking at either using a machine that doesn't match the strength curve of a muscle group to the resistance curve of an exercise versus using a machine that tries to match the two, right? So essentially, matching of the strength curve and resistance curve and measuring hypertrophy. We have one study on this. And essentially, there were no differences in hypertrophy. So even if you were to look at the most direct evidence we have on this sort of idea that neuromechanical matching can explain away these findings of longer muscle length training versus shorter muscle length training, that just doesn't seem to be true. We have one study, it doesn't show an effect. Equally, another mechanism put forth by some of these people is increases in fascicle length or sarcomere. That is largely and mostly taken from evidence either in animals or in humans who are stretching for at least an hour a day typically at very high intensities, so a lot of pain. And in fact, people have tried to replicate this. Eric Helms,
Eric Helms did it recently, right?
He did it, and he quit after a while because it was too painful.
Yeah.
So we're talking about durations of stretching lasting hours and hours and hours over, say, a week at high intensities at maximal muscle lengths, because that's how stretching is done. And you're comparing that to lengthened partials, where you spend, say, 10 to 20 seconds per session extra in the lengthened position with higher magnitudes of tension. Yeah. So I'm not really sure that I can see the two being super similar. Do they potentially share some similar mechanisms? Yes. But are you right to just equate the two? Absolutely not. And so I think jumping to the conclusion that sarcomerogenesis or increases in fascicle length are really what's driving the additional hypertrophy behind long muscle length training is simply one step too far.
Awesome, man. So I know it's a bit anecdotal, but you've trained for 10 months now purely in the lengthened muscle, right? Almost exclusively. Did you see any more or better results training like this than before, like when you did full range of motion? I know it's anecdotal, but for yourself, what is your experience like?
For sure. So I'm going to preface it real quick with a classic preface of, hey, N equals 1. There's a lot of confounders here, like higher stress, lower stress, worse sleep, better sleep, nutrition, a lot of things, training age even. And hey, maybe the water I was drinking had some stuff in it too. Who knows?
We're both not natural.
But basically, exactly, yeah. But yeah, so honestly, I think at the very least, I saw on par hypertrophy with previously. I do think some muscle groups have grown more. My suspicion is that my back has responded pretty well, and this could be confirmation bias because I've seen people like Alberto Nunez report similar things. So Alberto Nunez has switched to a lot of length training as well. Mm-hmm. And supposedly, and from what I've seen as well, his back seems to have improved a lot. I think most muscle groups have improved a pretty good amount. I think I've seen a bit more hypertrophy than usual. But again, it's an N equals 1, could be confirmation bias. But I do suspect it hasn't taken away from my results, and I think it might have added to it. So it's kind of the same, and again, could be confirmation bias, but it's kind of the same way I view the evidence on the topic, is that at the very least, I'm pretty sure I grew the same as usual, but there's a very good chance that I grew more than before. So that's how I view it.
Awesome. So yeah, for me, it's also anecdotal, but the same. Well, like I just stated, I don't purely train lengthen and partial, but I do really emphasize on getting a bigger stretch at like every movement. The thing is, it was a bit hard for my ego in the beginning. You know, you had to drop your dumbbells from like 50 kgs to like 36, everything. You like a 60-year-old guy from high school next to you is doing the same weights as you, right? Basically, he's going very fast. So for the ego, it was not fun, but I can like really say I'm a lot more sore because I got a bigger stretch, I got a bigger eccentric, and I notice more gains. However, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So I got a few like questions. You would agree that eccentric phase is very important, right, for muscle growth, hypertrophy.
Yes.
Given that it comes more, the muscle gets a bigger stretch, more stretch. When would there be? This is what I love to hear. When would there be like a point of diminishing returns that like you milk the eccentric perhaps too much? Like, you know, you want a slow, controlled eccentric, but is there like a point where, okay, now I'm fucking doing 20 seconds eccentrics, right? Okay, how long should an eccentric phase be? Should it be different for different muscles? Is there a concrete answer that you could provide, perhaps?
For sure. So with eccentric durations, there's a few things we know for sure, and there's some things we don't yet know. One thing we know for sure is that if you extend your eccentric way too long, you'll likely see less hypertrophy.
Yes.
So the best meta-analyses and the most recent ones we have on the topic demonstrate that if you take a rep and make it last over 8 seconds, right? For example, doing a 5-second eccentric, a second
German
pause
style,
at the
right?
bottom, exactly, and then like a 2 to 3 second concentric. At that point, you might be seeing less hypertrophy than if you control it less. So while you see some training camps, like for example, very high intensity training camps, they often make control weights like a lot, like 10-second concentric, 10-second eccentric. And at that point, you are likely seeing less muscle growth than if you were being a bit faster on the eccentric. Equally, we have evidence suggesting that somewhat controlled eccentrics might be better than not controlled eccentrics, right? So we have some evidence that, for example, doing 2 to 3 to 4 second eccentrics is better than like just letting the weight drop. Typically, as a rule of thumb, I think the best rule of thumb I can give from the evidence we have is make the eccentric last at least as long as the concentric. If you're doing that, I think for almost all people in all muscle groups and all movements, you're in the right ballpark. You don't need to go much over this, but you can if, for example, you think that it enhances your technique or what have you. But as far as all else being equal, I don't think you need to go much above this. So as long as your eccentric is at least the duration of your concentric, you're probably good. And obviously that's on average, right? Like if you're talking about the last rep of your set where you're grinding out a rep for 8 seconds, yeah, I don't want you to have your eccentric last over 8 seconds consistently. The interesting thing as well, though, is when you look at the meta-analyses we have on tempo or repetition duration, it looks like even repetitions as short as 1 second or so can be as effective or reasonably effective for hypertrophy. Now, I wouldn't put a lot of stock into this because, again, we have some evidence saying that 2 to 4 second eccentrics may be a little bit better. But it's possible that you actually see similar hypertrophy even if you have only like a 1 second eccentric. But for the time being, you know, in the absence of enough evidence to really be sure, I think that as long as you have some control on the eccentric and your eccentric is at least as long as your concentric, you're likely maximizing your muscle growth.
Yeah, because okay, so example, this morning I did bench press. Yeah? So I really tried to control. So I did 115 kilos, 6 reps, like 3 second eccentric control. I could do a lot more, like let's say 125 maybe, if the eccentric would be a bit faster. So then my question would be like, okay, so the eccentric is a bit slower, more controlled, but with less weight. You know, if I could also use a bit more weight, still a controlled eccentric, but a bit faster. I'm not sure yet where I feel like I respond the best, if that makes sense. Because I'm not dive bombing, you know, but I'm a bit faster. I can push a bit more weight, a bit slower. Obviously, I cannot push as much. So if I ask you this, like, what would be perhaps for me, no? Do I do the 125K so I can handle a bit more weight, also a bit more on the concentric? Because concentric for me is always pretty fast, so I try to be pretty explosive on the concentric and controlled on the eccentric, because I feel like I can recruit like more motor units when I really try to push it on the concentric. So obviously, if I look from an injury perspective, yes, less weight and more control, that would be obviously better. But like from a hypertrophy stance, and also maybe performance, but I'll touch on that later. Let's stick to hypertrophy for now. What would you say to that? Like, if I make that comparison?
Sure. So I'm going to challenge you on the injury thing. I think as long as you're relatively accustomed to it and acclimated to it, I'm not sure we have much evidence saying that, oh, a 1 second eccentric is going to be more injurious than a 3 second eccentric, right? Like, whenever you're talking about injury risks from lifting, there's a few things to realize. One, rates of injury from lifting are extremely low compared to most sports. Two, the best kind of evidence we have on rates of injury and lifting from different techniques, etc., is observational. So we look at injury rates in powerlifting versus physique sports versus weightlifting versus strongman, and we can make some sort of deductions from those findings. But equally, you have to keep in mind there's a lot of differences between, say, a physique sport and a strength sport, right? Where in physique sport, first of all, it's not homogeneous. So not everyone trains with the same tempo, same techniques, same exercises, same volume, same anything. And secondly, there's a lot of things that vary between those sports as well. So for example, in bodybuilding, you'll see that they typically use higher volumes, typically use more controlled tempos, typically use a greater variety of exercises, and a lot of other things. Versus powerlifting, for example, a much more specific exercise selection, much more specific loading, so heavier loading, usually faster tempo, etc. So while we can use these findings to somewhat come at, oh, maybe this plays a role, I wouldn't see it as super strong evidence. If you do look at the evidence on physique sports versus strength sports, generally tempos are a bit more controlled in physique sports, and you do see lower injury rates. So maybe it plays a role, but I wouldn't say it's strong evidence. And beyond that, like, I have not to this day found a study that compared, say, a slower to a faster tempo in a big sample and measured injury rates. So I'd be pretty cautious of people using preventing injury as a strong rationale for doing an
Slower
exercise a certain
eccentric.
way or another way, right?
Right.
Especially if you're used to it, because like even stuff like spinal flexion in a deadlift. For some people, if you're used to it and you get no pain, there may simply not be a reason to avoid it, right? Anyways, so for injury, I don't think it's a huge thing. For hypertrophy, I also don't think it's a huge thing. I think at the very least, we don't have the evidence to suggest it is. As I said, when you look at repetition durations of between about 1 second and 8 seconds, you see similar hypertrophy. While there is some preliminary data, a couple studies now, showing that maybe 2 to 4 second eccentric is a little bit better than 1, it's really not a huge difference. And so I would say, in all likelihood, as long as your eccentric is at least like a second with 125, you may be just fine going for 125 kilograms instead and using a slightly more aggressive tempo. Ultimately, I think it kind of comes down to what gives you a better technique. And by technique, I mean, for example, a better stretch, maybe better positioning if that's something you care about, right?
And what makes me perhaps more sore? Or don't you?
Perhaps. It's difficult to say because soreness ultimately, like, whenever someone uses soreness as a proxy for stimulus, for example, you got to keep in mind that we are not really sure that soreness, for example, correlates very well with muscle damage. There's some data showing it doesn't correlate that well. And so depending on what you even want to use soreness for, it may or may not be worth doing. But at any rate, I think that it mostly comes down to preference, right? So if a certain tempo improves your technique in a measurable, quantifiable, or visible fashion, use that tempo. But for the most part, I think it's just preference, right? Like if you prefer using a slightly slower tempo, going a bit slower, that's fine. If you prefer going a bit faster, that's fine too. But generally, the heuristic of have your eccentric be at least as long as your concentric is going to get you in that ballpark.
Awesome.
Make sense?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, man. I'm not like so what I've done a lot prior when I really got into the stretch mediated hypertrophy this year and everything. I've more than 2 years ago now, I think I've kind of decided, okay, I want a bigger bench. My bench sucks ass. It's, I cannot be a good influencer with this low ass bench, So I really bumped up the benching 2 times a week, a lot of different styles. And I've always had a pretty fast touch and go, but I made a tremendous gain. So I really got I think 2 years ago, there's still a video. I was at a lower body weight, but I never really benched, but I only did 90 kilos for 6 reps. And I got it all the way up to I think 120 for 9 reps in about 2 years. So a lot of progress there. But they were very fast reps. Now that I'm controlling it, no way that I'm getting 120 for 9 reps, But I'm really, I'm not sure yet what I want to do from now on, because now I'm doing them kind of slow and I'm not really sure on how I want to progress. The nice thing is about the faster reps is that I could really measure, okay, I did them fast in 2020, I do them fast now, so I can really see like the progress. Now that I'm doing a bit slower, sometimes I feel, because I'm so really focused on the rest, that it's a bit harder for me sometimes to track my progress. Oh, how fast did I do them now? Did I do 3 seconds? Did I 4 seconds? Because I'm really trying to, like milk. Oh, I want to feel it in the pecs. So it's a little bit more like in the end. Who gives a fuck, right? If you get like bigger and you got a good workout, who cares about the numbers you lift? But I kind of liked seeing the progress I really made with the bit faster touch and go reps. But yeah, if in the end, if it gives me a bigger chest to do like 3-4 seconds controlled, a little bit less ego, it might be better. I'm doing that now for a few months now. But yeah, the progress, it feels like it's a bit slower, but it's probably because I'm controlling it more. But also the only thing I feel is that because I'm so controlled, I sometimes feel that my concentric phase, I'm not recruiting as much power, if that makes sense. Because when I was fat, I felt like, let's go, I'm really like a fucking, go get it, come on, which I'm slapping my head and shit, doing some heavy metal Limp Bizkit, and I'm fucking, rapping the waves. Now I'm more controlled, and also my concentric phase isn't as fast. So I feel, I might,
That's an interesting train of thought. I think with the activation stuff, you're onto something. And if you look at the data we have on like purposely slowing down the concentric, for example, it does seem to show that, hey, if you're like lifting a pretty light load and you're not focused on being explosive, the activation or recruitment of motor units might be a bit lower. So the way to fix that typically is simply to try to be explosive with whatever weight you're using, right, on the concentric. So by trying to accelerate the bar as much as possible, yes, your reps will look a bit silly. Let's say, for example, you're doing 15 reps, right? The first rep of that set, if you're trying to be explosive, is going to look very fast, almost unnecessarily fast to some people. But equally, it'll just make sure that you recruit as many motor units as possible as early into the set as possible, because ultimately, the goal with any set for hypertrophy is to recruit and expose muscle fibers to tension as early as possible. And so being a bit more explosive, so controlled on the eccentric and a bit more explosive on the concentric seems to be the best approach. And in fact, when you look at the data on concentric tempo, pretty consistently slowing down the concentric purposely, like, slowing it down on purpose because you want to have more time or attention or whatever.
Feel the muscle better, I guess.
Worse.
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
That seems to be worse for hypertrophy.
Yes.
So as much as like for eccentric durations, we don't have super clear data, one thing we do seem to know is that slowing down your concentric is not the way to go.
Okay. So awesome. Thanks you for clearing that up for the bench press and the concentric and eccentric phase. I feel the same because I see a lot of people, like you say, perhaps not have a big stretch, or like let's say a dumbbell fly. They really tried, but the concentric phase tried to let's squeeze the muscle in. But whenever I do that, I feel like I'm having a worse workout actually, and the science actually backs that up. So. Yay.
It's weird. It's funny because bro culture has always heavily emphasized the peak contraction, the squeeze.
Exactly.
Squeeze that muscle.
Yeah.
And it turns out that's probably not as important as we thought.
Awesome. Okay, so I did that right.
Indeed, you did.
I've got a question for you. So I, my main goal is try to be as big as naturally human possible. But next to that, I also practice Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. I'm a purple belt, hobbyist. Like I don't want to be a world champion. I also don't want to be like really ass, like when I ever got my black belt in like 6-7 years, that a blue belt could tap me out. So I want to be okay, let's say, not very bad, not a world champion. For me, it makes a lot of sense because still I want as much hypertrophy as possible. But whenever I'm sparring someone, wrestling or picking them up, that also the last part of, let's say, like a bench press when I'm full locked out, that I want to be strong perhaps in every position. So now, not for hypertrophy, so perhaps lengthened partials are better for hypertrophy, but would you say that training full range of motion when I want to be strong everywhere, like let's say on the mat, makes sense or not?
Sure. That's an interesting question. And with any question of how should this activity transfer over to your sport, you can kind of follow the SAID principle. So specific adaptations to impose demands. So you have to ask yourself, what sort of positions am I trying to be strong in with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? And I'm not an expert in BJJ, right? I've done one session in my life, I enjoyed it, and then I was like, maybe I'll try it at some point, and then I never go around back to it. But anyways, my understanding with a lot of BJJ positions, at least, is that typically you're either, putting someone in a lock, what have you, and you're not the one at long muscle lengths, or you're being put in some sort of arm bar, for example, and so you're resisting excessive elbow extension, right? And in that case, you actually want to be strong in that lengthened position for the biceps because you can resist that, right?
Sure.
And so relatively rarely do you see, at least from what I can tell, in this sport, and that doesn't apply to every sport, right? There's going to be sports where you actually want to be strong in short muscle lengths,
yes.
right? Arm wrestling, for example, right?
Yeah.
Arm wrestling, for the most part, you're always in short muscle lengths,
Yeah.
so you need to actually be training those
Yeah.
positions.
Yeah.
But for BJJ, for example, I do think that even if you weren't to do much full range of motion work, you'd probably be fine.
Yeah.
I think if you wanted to be safe, you could do your heavy compound work as a full range of motion work, right? And then do the remainder of your work as lengthened partials.
Yeah.
That way, you still have some adaptations at short muscle lengths in a shortened position. But as far as I understand, in BJJ, you don't really get exposed to those short muscle length positions very often, right? For the most part, it's resisting some sort of long muscle length position, or it's putting someone else in an arm bar, in which case you're not the one at long muscle lengths or very short muscle lengths. You're kind of in the middle.
Yeah, I really want to emphasize that I still really think that training lengthened, or at least a deep stretch on the muscles really helps like your mobility. Exactly like you say, you're strong in those positions. Also, I don't know if you're familiar with the knees over toes, Ben Patrick.
Yep.
So I tore my ACL, meniscus, everything because I was like one of those guys like it's almost 5 years ago that I tore them with jiu-jitsu. And I was one of those guys that, no, I don't go, with my knees over my toes, or fuck that, that's dangerous, too much pressure.
Yeah.
And, I tore them all.
Yeah.
And now for like the last 3 years, I really do like crazy, I never got a surgery. And I do like crazy stuff like he does with the ATG split squats, everything knees over toes. And the physiotherapist said like, you're done, bro. You gotta get like, or change sports or whatever, but this is not it for you. And I'm sparring like crazy. So that's basically like the same thing because it's really like a stretch, perhaps on the vastus medialis, on the quadricep, on the quads. But I do think that there's a lot of holds in jiu-jitsu where you're also like perhaps in the short, but really have to tuck someone in or really be strong here. Or really extend someone out because we do a lot of extension. So really, so I think there's some positions where perhaps the shortened would be useful. But I'm also agreeing that if I think about it, mostly I'm trying to get out of because locks are mostly trying to overextend you in a little. Yes, exactly. So I'm 100%. Completely agreeing with that.
So what I'd say is like just look at your sport whenever you have this consideration, right? Like whether it's powerlifting is pretty obvious, but same with BJJ, same with soccer, same with any sport really that you want transfer from lifting into, is just look at the joint angles involved. If some of the joint angles or most of the joint angles are pretty short muscle lengths, it probably makes sense to include some full range of motion work or even some shortened partials, right? They're not going to be ideal for hypertrophy, but you do see that performance adaptations are range of motion specific, right? So if you want to get better at short muscle lengths, like strong or what have you, train in that range of motion. That makes sense.
Awesome. So I got really like two big questions that I still want to ask if I could. One being that, so I'm now, like I said, really focusing on getting a big stretch on every muscle. A comment that I get a lot. So let's say I'm doing a pec fly. I'm really trying to get it as far as my chest can so I can really feel the stretch like this. Or when I do Romanian deadlifts, like sometimes I even put my foot on a platform and I get like the bar below that. So big stretch on the hamstrings. I get sore for like 3-4 days, but it's awesome. But people often ask me when I say, hey, your muscles probably grow more when I get stretched out, but people often say like, hey, isn't this perhaps dangerous for me? And not that they're disagreeing, but they're perhaps a bit scared of like, hey, if I'm not now gonna do like this, I always did like shortened freaking incline presses, and now I'm going all the way this. Could that be perhaps dangerous for me because my muscles are not used to it? What would you say? Like, could that perhaps start really low, or try to not instantly go as deep as possible, or perhaps slide into it for training from training? What would be your approach to that?
Sure. So, disclaimer, I'm not an injury expert. I'm not a physio. None of that.
Disclaimer,
right?
people.
None of that expert.
If you die, you
Exactly,
die.
Yeah,
Thanks.
exactly. What I'll say is generally one finding from physical therapy is that graded exposure or gradually getting used to a new stimulus is a good thing, right, for preventing injury. And so when you're talking about taking someone, especially someone who's only been doing, for example, like shortened partials, right? Like you were that guy.
A strong guy.
You were that guy who was doing half squats,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Like you were training shortened partials. If I were to take you 4 or 5 years ago and make you go straight into lengthened partials only, yeah, that's probably not the best idea,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
However, we can gradually get you used to those positions. And in fact, by training in those positions, you'll gradually get more flexible, more mobile, and be able to go deeper and deeper. So I would say, let's say I'll take the example of myself 2 or 3 years ago. I was doing exclusively full range of motion, and I was starting to want to get into lengthened partials. If I wanted to get into it as quickly as possible, what I would probably do is over the course of like a month or two, start doing, for example, in the first couple of weeks, maybe a third of my work or a quarter of my work with lengthened partials. Then after a few weeks, I feel pretty good, make it half. After a few weeks, make it more. So gradually shifting the emphasis. I don't think there's any data at present, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have super good data as far as injury rates go, to my knowledge, in powerlifting, bodybuilding, never mind with different techniques involved, right? Like going into a deeper stretch, what have you. So it's all sort of mechanistic rationale based as far as how we determine what's more injurious, what's not. In all likelihood, based on the evidence we have, your body's pretty adaptable. And if you gradually expose yourself to those longer muscle length positions, there's a very, very solid chance that it won't be any more injurious than regular training. The same goes for like arm wrestlers, right? When they're training at super short muscle lengths during lifting, they're usually fine because they've gotten very used to it. You know, your body can adapt to positions. That's, for example, why you see that performance adaptations are greater when you train the range of motion of the outcome. Specificity does matter. And so if you gradually expose yourself to the demands of a given range of motion, a given muscle length, etc., my hunch is you should be fine. I think that people in general love to fearmonger lifting. So if you go on Athlete and X's channel, if you go into the gym, if you speak to my mother, she'll tell you I should have ended up in a wheelchair years ago. Somehow I'm fine. What I'll say is, like, especially people who haven't been lifting for a long time, or who haven't lifted at all, are under the impression that lifting is the super injurious thing. And if anything looks out of the ordinary, they'll see it as even more injurious. And then you also have the old heads who are like, oh, unless you're doing constant tension training with 225 on the bar, you're going to get snapped up or something like that, right? Like, people will always have some sort of fear-mongering claim to any unusual thing, just because they don't really have much education on the topic typically.
Awesome. All right, so I've got one more question that I wrote down, and
Hit me.
perhaps we can wrap it up. We've almost hit the 1 hour mark, but awesome. This conversation is really helpful also for me, and hopefully also the viewers that are watching this, I should say. So this is not really lengthened or perhaps your work field question, but more like a general one. So the last year, we're really seeing in the natural community sort of a renaissance of natural bodybuilding. So I'm on YouTube for like, my channel is like almost 8 years old now. And I remember like 6 years ago, I would say like everybody, especially if they're bigger than me, would be on roids. And I would say, nah, that's not possible naturally. And, you know, fuck them all Gymshark athletes, etc. So like as we say here. But now we see some natural physiques, like perhaps other YouTubers like Joffrey, Verity Schofield, Natural Hypertrophy, Alex Leonidas, yourself perhaps. I'm trying to be the one in like Netherlands, but there are a lot of guys. What is there a natural limit? There's a debate that there perhaps is not a natural limit like we thought. Like when I started, it was like, yeah, bro, like after 5 to 10 years, nope, no more gains for you, my guy. You won't grow. There's a limit, and then you gotta roid up and let's go, you know? Now there seems to be a shift where there are people's like, yeah, perhaps you can grow like forever. If we look at Lay Norden, he had a powerlift convention a few months ago where he set another personal record, this guy is, I think, like 41 or 40, and he's been lifting before I was born, I think. So, yeah, what would be your take on that? Like natural hypertrophy, is there a limit? Can we achieve more than we perhaps thought we could?
Sure. So let me first touch on whether or not there is a natural limit theoretically. Theoretically, there absolutely is, right? Let's say you were born and from day one, your goal in life was to get as jacked as possible. You're a baby, but you're already thinking, all right, let's get jacked. Theoretically, if you were to make the best use of your time from day one of your life until last day, there will be a time in your life, say typically at age 40 to 60, when you're at your peak natty jackedness. But that's if you optimize everything, right? Many people, and this is kind of normal, make trade-offs on that path. So many people won't actually reach their natural potential. It does exist. Somewhere there's some sort of natty limit for them as a person in terms of their genetics, etc. And there are factors physiologically that will stop you from getting past a certain muscularity given your genetics and everything else. But for most people, it's more so a matter of what trade-offs they're willing to make, right? So for example, if you start lifting at age 40, you're not going to get as jacked as if you start lifting at age 20 at your peak. It is what it is. Will you still gain muscle? Yes. So there is definitely such a thing as some sort of natural limit, theoretically. Practically speaking, however, I think the idea of a natural limit takes away a lot of power from the individual, right? Because then it's like, oh, okay, well, there's a limit anyways, and it's getting hard to make gains, so I'll just assume I'm at limit. In reality, nearly no one is at their true limit, right? Yeah. Nearly everyone has some gains left to make.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of figuring out what trade-offs you can make, how you can gain more muscle, and then what trade-offs you're willing to make, right? For example, I'm guessing you train like 4 to 6 days a week, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Like, you could feasibly train twice a day, right? But then you maybe have to quit your job or something. So, and you probably make more gains if you train, say, 6 days a week versus 5, or what have you. And the question then becomes, well, if you train 5 days a week and you're making very slow or no gains anymore, can you truly say you're at your limit? Because in all likelihood, you're not. There's just certain trade-offs that you're not willing to make, and that will thus not allow you to reach your theoretical natty limit. And so that's worth keeping in mind, that there is likely a natty limit somewhere, but that it's quite difficult to reach, and that you have to make lots of trade-offs and, all that stuff. What I'll say as well is that people are under the impression that natties can't make any gains, essentially, that you can't, benching 3 plates, for example, is impossible as a natty. Like, there's some people who genuinely think that. And with genetics being a factor, and with sort of normal distribution of how much muscle can people gain, there will be some natties that can get more jacked than a lot of steroid users, straight up, right? Like, if you look at Jeff Alberts, for example, of 3DMJ, he's about 50 years old now, I think, and he's more jacked than a lot of steroid users, right? Because they have worse genetics, because they chose not to make certain trade-offs nutritionally or what have you, or in terms of just sticking with training for long enough. And so genetics alone can make certain natties more jacked than certain steroid users. And so the impression that, oh, I can't be jacked because I'm a natty, and the natty limit is like dooming me to being small forever, that's likely not true. Your best bet is still just doing your best as far as training goes, as far as nutrition goes, with regards to the trade-offs you're willing to make. And then finally, there's also this sort of assumption that once you've been training for like 5 or 10 years, once you reach your mid-20s or whatever, you can't make gains anymore. And that's also wrong. If you look at the evidence on testosterone over time, on muscle mass potential over time, natties can still make solid gains until their 40s, 50s, right? Comfortably. Yeah. For example, if you look at, as an example, anecdote again, if you look at Jeff Alberts, right? Like, he's maintained or gained muscle in the past like 10, 20 years, right? Has it been a lot of muscle? To some people, it'll be like, no, especially if you're taking enhanced standards as your own standards, right? Like, I've got friends who are enhanced, and like friends at the same height as me. Like, I'm about 6'2" and 240 at the moment, so that's about 110 kilograms. And like, I have enhanced friends the same height as me, and within a year, they would gain like 20 pounds of muscle, like on a pretty low dose. And it's like, so if I was enhanced, like I would be 250, 260 or something, I don't know. And yeah, if you go by those standards, natties are like, oh, I guess I'm just small forever. Yeah. But then you look at physiques from like the 1920s or what have you, before testosterone, for example, is really a thing. And you can see that they're plenty jacked, right? They're very impressive. The final thing I'll say about natty social media and the natty sort of renaissance in social media is, don't be fooled by smoke and mirrors, right? Like, I've met a lot of these people who are very jacked on the internet and like natties, like influencers, right? Relatively well-known influencers. And oftentimes on social media, you can look super jacked, even as a natty, if you're lean enough under good lighting with the right angle, etc. But then if you see them in person, like don't get me wrong, they're jacked, but they're not anything out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
And I think that most people who've been lifting consistently pretty hard for 5 or 10 years end up in a somewhat similar place. Is there still a normal distribution? Yes. But just because you see someone on social media and you're like, wow, they're huge, I could never reach that, they must be on juice and what have you, they could very well be natty and have just really good lighting, good angles, etc. And that's been my experience meeting some of these influencers who look huge on social media in person. It's like, okay, like you're jacked, but like I could see you at the gym and be like, oh, nice physique, dude, and that's it. Like
People
nothing more
seem
than that.
in 2023 still not to understand how angles and lighting work. Like I can literally post like where my arm looks like 3 times bigger than my whole body, and then just stand normal on the camera, and it looked like I've made a transformation, like, and I lost 20 kilos. I could say like, oh, I had a disease, I lost 20 kilos, when it's literally like 10 seconds apart, and people still don't seem to get that. But yeah, whatever. No, awesome take, man. And I would, if I could touch on that, like, okay, so let's take me for example. Like 2 years ago, I did not perhaps do the lengthening stuff. I did not do a great stretch the bottom, etc., etc. But I was already training for like 10 years plus. So a lot of people, also perhaps other YouTubers, I would not name them, but they would say in my shoes, okay, you're at your limit now, or I'm at my limit now if I was another influencer, like a lot. So I'm going to take TRT now. But you can see now, perhaps in hindsight, but you were training like for 10 years, but maybe 7 of those 10 years were like very suboptimal. So yeah, of course you made some gains, but this is not like your limit. You're trying to stay like fucking 9% body fat all year round. You're doing like shit splits. Yeah, like, your training style sucks. So and if I would think for myself, like there's a lot of muscle groups that I didn't like try to spam, right? So perhaps my forearms can still grow, because I do some reverse bicep curls, I do some stuff, but like I didn't try every freaking movement that there is to try to get up my forearm. So I've done a lot of chest work and perhaps back work, but you would think there's always like some muscle that could benefit from some exercise, some other movement that I'm not yet doing. So and I've got to do that for like, not for like 2 months, because but like 1, 2, 3 years before I see real results. So if I would think like that, it would take me like 20 years plus at least to get like every freaking muscle to the max size, So how could you be in 5 years at your max? That makes no sense at all. But I was one of those guys that said like 8 years ago, after 5 years you're done, mate.
For sure. To truly reach your natty limit, you need to leave no stone unturned. People don't understand that. It's like, okay, I've been lifting for 3 years using this generic template bodybuilding program online. Guess this is it. Okay, I'm gonna stop lifting now.
No advanced programming, no nothing. Like just my 5 times 5, I didn't progress, bro. So time for the TRT. Like what the hell?
Exactly, it's crazy. And there's this new thing as well in fitness in general. Is like, as soon as people reach 30, they're like, okay, TRT now.
It's crazy, man. It's like creatine.
You know that if you're in good health overall, there's a good chance that you'll be fine until much later into your life. So if you want to go on TRT, sure, go on TRT. But just like, don't be under the illusion it's for your health or for everything else. Like, it may just be because you want to be more jacked, and that's fine. But just be honest to yourself and others,
Yeah, and then then use like 500 milligrams a week and say, no, it's just for my hormones, bro.
Just TRT, bro. Just I'm getting old. I'm 28.
It's crazy, man.
It's like,
Milo, it was really awesome to talk to you. I'm trying to get this up later today. Normally I've got some
awesome.
A person that makes my thumbnails, but I'm probably gonna make an ugly ass thumbnail myself. But I'm trying to get it on today, because normally I post on Tuesday.
Sure.
If not tomorrow, but I should be fine today.
If you'd like, if you can send me a physique pic of yours, I can get my editor to do it if you want.
Sure, dude. Like, honestly, sure.
I'll ask. I can't guarantee anything.
Okay.
I'll send you a message if
I'm
you can.
fully bulked right now, so don't expect abs.
Just any, bro. Any physique pictures from like the last couple of years. It's fine.
All right.
Doesn't need to be recent.
No,
I
I'm
feel
gonna
you.
make it recent, but I'm gonna use all the angles I can to make it as as big as possible.
That's cool.
Yes.
That's cool.
No, awesome. Milo, if people want to search you for your awesome work, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on YouTube at Wolf Coaching. I recently started a channel, been doing my best to put out 2 videos a week, and hopefully they're informative, pretty evidence-based. On Instagram, you can find me at Wolf Coach. That's my last name and coach. And finally, you can find my website at wolfcoaching.com and my research output at, if you just type in ResearchGate Milo Wolf, you'll find all my research on range of motion, reps and reserve, some research with Brad Schoenfeld as well. So check that
Awesome,
out.
man. And so in 6 days you got your defense, and then when is if everything goes well, when can we finally call you a doctor then?
I think, so technically, I think in a couple of weeks you can, provided everything goes well.
Oh, so I actually
Yeah.
should like wait for this video to come out in like a month. And, I spoke to a doctor, you know.
No, you'll be fine. You'll be fine.
No, I'm speaking to a soon-to-be doctor, so I take it. I'll take it.
It's even better, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Milo, thanks for joining me, and perhaps in the future, would love to
Yeah,
pick
we'll do
your
it
brain
again,
on
man.
other
That's
things.
awesome. Thanks for having me. I'll see you soon, yeah?
Later,
Peace,
bro.
peace.